and it was within my jobs, I guess the personal aspects though also, as I used to work at Heritage Preservation. And we still do, we still plant cornfields of our own native corn species for tribal members to use. And we have spells where we don't get any. And you go back in and you look and you see it's either too dry or just too wet. And that seems to be increasing more and more. We get very, very few successful harvests off of the big cornfields that we plant, where we used to be able to just put the seed out and they would just grow. They would go, and the weather would never perfect, but it would be enough for them to grow and you get a successful harvest. And we're seeing lesser and lesser yields on those type of plants. And we find that it's not the seeds themselves. We'll take the seeds, and where if you take care of them individually in smaller plots, they come up just fine. But when you put them out again in these big fields, it kind of just let's just let nature take care of it and go. They're not coming up. And again, it's not the soil, it's not the seeds. A lot of it has to do with the weather, and we're seeing these changing weather patterns. So when I was in Heritage Preservation, we started taking to creating smaller plots where we could provide a little bit more care and a little bit more maintenance so that we could up the yield. I'm very much an amateur, I would say. We're very much amateur foragers. We have our mentors and the people that that are go-to people, of course, our books, but we do have individuals very knowledgeable that we go and speak with and talk to and learn different things from. And in that instance, because it's new to me, I think my wife would be able to give a lot more insight into it. But in some of the individuals that we talked with, like I said, we're amateurs. We go out and harvest here and there, get a few things, and it's a fun pastime for us. But for one individual I'm thinking of in particular, he does this all the time. This is how he feeds himself and his family. And he has provided us information. And just like in this last year, going and speaking with him on the classes, the berries, the fruiting plants that didn't fruit this year because of some very odd weather patterns that took place in the spring. And again, coming from a guy who spent the better part of his life living in the woods, watching this, he's in tune, he knows when things come into season. For him to come to say, these are really strange weather patterns. I've not seen it like this before, and this has been going on for the last couple of years. And he would attribute that. He knows there's climate change, there is a change occurring. But that really makes us sit up and take notice. We've noticed a decline in some of the plants that we like to go after and get sometimes. And again, a lot of times there was a late frost and it completely wiped out the plums where we would go look for plums. I mean, that's just one specific example. But it was a really odd late frost, or was it an early thaw? I can't remember what it was last year. But I think it was an early thaw, and where a lot of these plants started to blossom and started to bloom way too early. And then they got hit again with the deep freeze and the frost that came in and wiped out, and you lose out on a big portion of it. But it was a really odd weather cycle that kicked in, and this was just last year.
We did look at a long-term data on how actual temperature and precipitation has changed over the last 60 years or so. We used a lot of that information to better understand how changes in temperature and precip were impacting corn and soybean yield trends over the last 30 or 40 years. Overall, the trends that we found across the state of Wisconsin for temperature was that the most significant warming trends were occurring during winter and springtime and at nighttime, and that there are large portions of the state that have seen trends towards a very large decrease in the frequency of very cold nights or below zero. So overall, while we've seen quite a bit of warming, most of it is focused during the wintertime and during nighttime. We generally saw that about 30% of the year-to-year variation in yields were contributed to those trends in climate on a county-by-county basis, which is a pretty large, I guess, percentage of what you would expect to see. Those trends have also contributed to a trend towards earlier springtime planting of corn in particular, to the point that we plant corn about 10 days earlier now than we did about 40 years ago. And we know that for every extra day of earlier planting, that usually equals about an increase of 1 to 3 bushels per acre in corn yield at the end of the season. So it's been a pretty significant contribution, not only here in Wisconsin, but across the Midwest in yield trends since the 1970s. Looking forward, as temperature patterns change and precipitation patterns change, Wisconsin happens to lie in a climate regime that has a very significant gradient in terms of the types of hybrids for corn that we can plant from the south to north. So we're not like other southern corn belt states like Iowa and Illinois, where they generally plant the latest maturing crop types or hybrids, longest season varieties. We can go from a long season variety in the south all the way to a very, very short season variety up in the north. And that span creates quite a large gradient in the yield that we get from those crops. So it's a little bit uncertain, but we could turn out to be more like a state like Iowa or Illinois in 50 years when it comes to a more consistent array of hybrids that are planted. And it's important just to keep track of the changes as they go along. Well, they're basically always trying to take advantage of the long growing season. So they generally just have a longer frost-free period. They generally don't have to deal with a lot of what we would call late spring frost that could damage crops after they've come out of the ground, which is something we do have to be concerned about here in Wisconsin. It really comes down to planting hybrids and genotypes that are best suited for that warmer climate, so you don't get into a situation where you're planting shorter season varieties that aren't taking advantage of the length of the growing season. So another potential problem is having more pests over winter that generally might be relegated further south where they're basically able to survive winters. Those might gradually shift northward and migrate as our winters become warmer. So that could create another management issue for farmers and growers in the region that they don't have to deal with right now. I mean, they do have to deal with pests, but not necessarily all the ones that could be coming into the region. Well, I guess some examples would be soybean aphid, which actually was first discovered in Wisconsin around the year 2000 or 2001. Since then, farmers have come up with ways to manage that pest by knowing a threshold at which they need to spray and act on. Things like European corn borer. I'm not going to remember all the names of them, but some of these could be found as far south as the Gulf Coast. And I don't know if those would eventually migrate all the way up here or not, but things that are found in Missouri, southern Illinois, Kentucky area, southern Iowa are definitely fair game in the next few decades. The weed problem could be pretty significant because weeds generally react just like any other plant in terms of how their phenology or their biological stages of growth could change. If we see warming in springtime, farmers may have to adjust the way they go about and spray before they have emergence taking place or even before they have things planted in the ground. So it's a really big problem because the other issue is that with a variety of weeds that are found in the seed bank and the soils, there are different weeds that come up at different times of the year, and it's already a management mess. Changes in climate will only create more chaos, I guess, to that management problem. And generally a lot of the crop types too are C3 crops, which means they will react more strongly to increases in atmospheric CO2. Corn being a C4 plant isn't going to respond as much to increases in CO2, so there might be a competitive edge given to weeds in the future, unfortunately, as atmospheric CO2 goes up also. I mean, I would venture to guess that it probably has a lot to do with water availability, frequency of rainfall, the temperatures also, and any shift in frequency of hot days, or just the length of the growing season, or just how warm a season might be, is likely to change those systems just as much as anything else. So I wouldn't think tobacco is any special case that's sort of shielded from impacts of changing climate. So I think probably all starts with data collection on the farm and keeping good records. I mean, large-scale operators already do this. They know what hybrids they're planting. They know when they planted them, when they harvested them. They keep all that type of information. But a part-time farmer, or someone who's maybe not as technologically advanced or isn't able to afford those types of electronic management tools, handwritten records kept, those will be very valuable, moving forward, to try to piece together, like, okay, this did well this year, it didn't do well this year. That person may not have the expertise necessarily to piece those pieces of information together, but surely we have expertise at the university that can help. And we're already tracking a lot of these things, temperature trends and precipitation patterns and trends in planting and harvesting of different crops, as well as pests, I guess, too, and when they show up. For most of our traditional crops, it's really understanding how climate has changed in a way to affect your growing season length, as well as the number of growing degree days that you have available in a season. You want to make sure that you're planting the hybrid that's best suited for your region based on the recent weather and climate, and that might mean just the last 5 or 10 years rather than the last 30 or 40. And I think crop consultants and seed companies are kind of on top of these things already and making sure that people get what they're supposed to have. The second thing would be adjusting planting dates to the point where you're not planting so early that you end up with plant emergence and then a killing frost, which is generally what happened in 2012 around here with the 80-degree weather we had in March. Things went into full bloom, and then we had killing freezes after that. So we're kind of in a tough spot. There will always be a tendency of people wanting to get things in the ground early, but there's a risk that's associated with that. So climate change also impacts other ecosystem services that we're deriving from the landscape. So it impacts the amount of erosion or runoff in phosphorus or nitrogen that we might have. We have to pay attention to, increasing frequency of heavy rainfall events, what that might mean from a land management standpoint, and what type of management practices should we be doing compared to what we're doing today to minimize and reduce the amount of runoff. We want to keep track of the amount of nitrate leaching that we have going past the root system, do the amount of nitrogen fertilizer and manures that are applied to cropping systems, tracking the amount of carbon that's stored in soils, which we often call carbon sequestration, and other things that might be associated with impacts on flooding. And there are certain management practices that we could do that might mitigate the frequency of flooding that might take place also, given the amount of water that's taken up by different species. So it's, we like to think of things as a system as a whole, and not just to think about it in terms of yield and what do we need to do to increase productivity and stay on top of that, because oftentimes there's a trade-off. When we maximize productivity, there's trade-offs with the environment that we should be keeping note of too as climate changes also.
Growing up as a gardener, I was always observing plants and trying to keep an eye to when the first frost was going to be, for example. And here we are, I'm talking to you today on October 19th, and we have yet to have a significant frost up here. Now if you look at the date that the USDA puts out, the first frost could be expected anytime between the beginning of September and mid-October. So at this point, we're past mid-October, and we have yet to have a significant frost. We have had one frost. It was not a killing frost. And as a gardener, as much as I like to see that, it's a little disconcerting to know that that trend is continuing. This isn't new. It's definitely part of a greater trend. So, you know, I've been a maple sugar producer for about 12 years, just on a small home scale, and noticed that every year things seem to be very different from historically how it was here. You know, we've got the maple sugar moon in the Ojibwe calendar, and that doesn't necessarily always fall on when maple syrup is happening, and it's interesting to see how that has changed over the historical period when the climate was more or less stable in this region. So yeah, it's definitely a cause for concern, and I think that we just need to be adaptable and you know, be taking extra care, really looking at our role in keeping our forests healthy, and really looking at the farm as an ecosystem so that we can keep our soils healthy, keep ourselves healthy, and doing that by you know, building resilience into the farm ecosystem. So instead of systems that are solely reliant on fossil fuel, they might be cheap and easy right now, but they won't be for very long. And they don't build strength and resilience into the system. In fact, they're very vulnerable. Yeah, I've seen a number of changes, and I think we need to follow suit and make changes ourselves. I'm trying to be rooted in both permaculture concepts as well as you know, traditional ecological knowledge. Those are both keen interests of mine. You know, I didn't grow up learning about those things, but like so many of us, as we've realized the implications of climate change, and also just finding a better way to do things, I'm constantly trying to think of new, innovative ways to bring in old practices and to turn things on their head. You know, we tend to look at problems, and there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of maybe misguided energy or misdirected energy within gardening and farming circles, in my opinion. Instead of looking at dandelions, for example, as a foe, or, you know, taking a militaristic approach of snuffing it all out, let's actually take a step back and pause and think about what is the ecological niche of a dandelion? What is the role of a dandelion? Well, it's one of the first plants to bloom, and so it provides a vital pollen and nectar source for our pollinators, which are in trouble, as we all know. It has a deep taproot. Well, what does that taproot do? Does it actually compete with nutrients as we tell ourselves? With a green bean, for example, that has fibrous roots near the surface of the soil? No. In fact, they can live symbiotically together because, of course, that dandelion, with its basal growth, spreads out over the top of the soil, and its role is to hold the soil in place and to build soil. So if we spend all of our energy pulling dandelions, we won't ever see a dandelion as a potential friend and ally, and won't ever appreciate that dandelion as a teacher. Of course, also dandelion is an anti-cancer medicine, and so and everyone knows dandelion wine is, you know, an old-time favorite. So, I mean, right here we've got many uses of this plant, not just to humans, but also to, as, you know, filling a vital role within the ecosystem. And that's just one plant. Every plant has something to tell us. So I think that we need to be a little bit more humble as farmers and gardeners, and also blur the lines between you know, foraging and traditional gathering and farming. And I hear many of my colleagues here at Red Cliff say, well, you know, we were never farmers, and it really depends on how you define farmer. I think when you think of a farm as a monoculture of rows and rows of beans and corn, or you have a, you know, confined animal feeding operation, you know, feeding cows or pigs in a barn, you know, the size of a football stadium. Well, that to me shouldn't be our vision of a farm for the future. And like we do need to be thinking with more systems with more of a systems approach. What are the components of a forest? Well, we have predators, larger mammalian predators. Well, we fill that niche pretty nicely. Then we have smaller mammals. So you've got, maybe you have goats or sheep or rabbits. These herbivores in a potential farm setting. Think of like a really integrated farm with all the different kinds of animals. And we can think of novel approaches of ways to use animals to cycle fertility. Right here we have really thick clay soils, and people say, well, that's a problem, that's a shame. Well, how can we turn that problem into a solution? Well, the clay holds the water really well. With an uncertain climate, the clay soil in a way is an adaptation to climate that we don't have to worry about. We're lucky that we have clay soils here. Now we just need to add organic matter, and that's not hard. We need animals, we need to be growing plants, and using chop and drop, you can grow plants just for the purpose of building organic matter. We have started growing a lot more cover crops in the farm this year. So thinking 2 steps down the line, not just waiting until the spring of, we got to spread manure to put soil organic matter, or the fall spreading manure, but really thinking years ahead, and recognizing that this is a slow approach, but it's a more it's an approach that is building integrity and building resilience, and so yeah, I think that's part of the solution. Well, I think all cultures around the world have these stories, that talk about a time of rapid change that is coming in. We hear about that within the Anishinaabe prophecies, and I really think that it's no coincidence that we're sitting here and talking about this. The more that we integrate our hearts and minds, and do the physical work, but also pay attention to signs and listen to the stories of the elders. I think there's a lot of wisdom in those stories. I don't think that they're just old-fashioned or some. So for me, I feel like this has been a really good opportunity, and I'm just getting my feet wet. I'm new in this position, but I feel like I bring a lot of knowledge and expertise, but I have so much to learn, and everyone has something to give and something to teach. Just because a kid comes out here, for example, we had some youth out here today helping plant trees, they might have a different approach because they're totally new to that, and just their innate nature might bring in might help shift my understanding of something. Sometimes experience and a lifelong knowledge can get in the way too. So yeah, I think elders and youth all have roles to play. Whether it's, but I really think that we need to be connecting our hearts and our brains. I think for too long we've been under the illusion that the brain is what controls, I think when we can recognize that the roles that thinking and feeling play together, that we can come to a better alliance within our own selves, and we won't be working against ourselves or against our best interests. And yeah, I'm really excited that I'm working under a number of people who have come before here, both ancestors who have passed away. My ancestors were farming ancestors, and then the ancestors of this land. Some of them recently deceased, and so I look at all those people, those elders, both living and deceased ancestors, for guidance, I think sometimes I take myself too seriously, but I think it's a time where we have to be serious in our approach. But some comedy and some lightheartedness is good too. This garden has been here for a number of years, and my role in it is just very new. But you know, there's been food that's been distributed to the community, and people have learned how to save seed and can and participate in their own food traditions. I think that's really vital in terms of cultural understanding of who we are, and our connection to food and to the land. I mean, I think a lot of disease, you know, nowadays is we have a lot of disease of excess, you know, because we're looking to fill voids in our lives, and we have all these quick, simple fixes that really aren't fixes in the long run. And I think we all have family members and friends and loved ones who have some of these diseases. Maybe we do. And but I think the real fix is you know, connecting with our root cultures, whether you're European American, Native American, and I think you know, that's partly what the farm offers. It's not just about growing food. It's not just about, you know, food units, pounds and dollars of food, worth of food, but also about connecting. You know, the name of the farm, Minobama Ziwin, meaning the good life. You know, and with an emphasis on you know, paying attention to what things have maybe fallen by the wayside, but are actually important to pick back up again. So we have some communities. There's the Bellinger settlement, for example, outside of Red Cliff, which historically has been a agricultural region and an area where people from Red Cliff, tribal members, have grown a lot of food, and so these things are still part of the culture of the area. But I think some of it has kind of fallen by the wayside for convenience, and I think what we'll find in the long run is that it's actually a lot more convenient to you know, take part in your food system, teaching your children, having the elders play a vital role. You know, it's about community health, the whole community coming together to celebrate, and you know, we can have fun together, we can learn together, and we all benefit. You know, if we're just sitting home and are isolated in our houses watching television and eating, you know, convenience foods, that might be fun for the short period, but it's not going to help us adapt to climate change. It's not going to help us keep our cultures alive and well and thriving. I think that bringing in a lot of foods that are traditional to my ancestors' diet is important, but also doing it in a way that is you know, reflective of the shifting climate. So by all means, we need to support wild rice beds, for example, because wild rice is subject to a lot of effects by a fluctuating rainfall, for example. This year was a poor wild rice yield, and I think we can say, well, that, you know, there's a cyclical nature to wild rice harvest, and that's true, but are we still seeing that same, you know, historical cycle at play, or is it directly affected and reflective of the shifting climate? And I think it is, and I think that embracing traditional ecological knowledge means putting humans back into as vital caretakers of the ecosystems in which we live. Humans are really good at creating disturbance, but that's actually our ecological role. We just need to create planned disturbance, smart disturbance. So instead of tilling, you know, forever, you know, using a lot of fossil fuels, or even if you just did it with horse and oxen, still the end result is the same. I mean, I think there will always be a role that our annual plants have in the farm ecosystem, but surrounding those by perennials. Clover is a great example of a introduced plant that has a huge vital role to play in the farm ecosystem, and even though it is an introduced plant, can really benefit these native landscapes. So I think we also need to just do away with the kind of militaristic approach to plants and to problems, and see problems as potential solutions. So if we see, a plant coming in that we're not aware of how it might benefit the landscape, but it's coming in droves, and it really wants to be here because it's so fecund and it grows so abundantly in this landscape. Instead of just investing in Monsanto to kill it with herbicides, I think we should that should give us pause and see what we can learn about that plant. So many of the quote-unquote invasive plants actually do have, in my opinion, a vital role to play in building resilience to climate change, because they feed a lot of herbivores. They are perennials. They tend to be perennials, and a lot of them are soil builders. Some of them are nitrogen fixers, and goats eat all of them.
Well, the importance is going to be to, as Patty said, to feed the people, and it was set up more as a teaching, to teach the people to garden. So, and we used to go out and, well, I shouldn't say we because I never did, but they used to go out and till up gardens for community members. So, they had a plot that they wanted to use for their own garden, they'd go out and till it up for them and prep it. During the winter they plant seedlings in the hoop house, and then in the spring they have a plant giveaway. So, and that's, what the garden was all about, to teach people to be self-sufficient.
Well, I think that goes back to the herbs, that goes back to the medicines, that goes back to the differences in understanding the soils, and understanding water flow, and understanding not everything has to be destroyed with a chemical, that you can actually use another plant to actually remove something, a pest, versus reaching for Roundup. And the Western, they always just want to kill right away, where if you bring in the knowledge of herbs, medicinals, and plant those things alongside of each other, and to prepare that soil with different enzymes, different food types, materials, and implant that in, like using the manures and bringing in the compost and bringing the leaves and the eggshells and all those types of things in a natural way, then you're bringing more nutrients into your ground, into your plant, into your food. So I believe the answer to that question would be combinations of what grows well next, like our three sisters, what grows well next to something else, and have them help each other. So I believe that would be the answer to that, and as far as the Western, I think there's a little knowledge that we can glean from the Western side, with the technologies of the thermographs, the imagings, the heat sources, analyzing things with, heat and checking the compositions of the soils, how much is radiating from that, checking the rhythms of the soil, the actual music that's happening in the soil. The Western side brings that to us with the technology that we have. So we can marry them together nicely as we grow the technological side. We can apply that into the garden, in a non-harming way. You know, no, we'd have to be cautious with radiation and what comes off of the actual ions of the different equipment, and make sure that we have the breathing space and the airflow. So, you know, I believe that they can marry together well. My dream would be that this place would be exuberant with life, overflowing, and it would be full, and the crops would be a full harvest. That every element that we have within here, I think I love the Oneida Nation. I love how they have such a balance with machinery and what they're doing with their buffalo and their garden, and they inspire me. And so
And the enthusiasm
the
of their community.
enthusiasm, yeah. And I would love to see the enthusiasm come, and I would love to see everyone's voice here. And if they love lavender, plant lavender. If you love grapes, plant grapes. If you love pears, do pears. If you love to can. And I want to see a fire here, and I want to see singing here, and I want to see harvesting here. You know, I want my dream would be that, you know, next year I would like to have part of our harvest excuse us, part of our harvest go to the community, but also have a section set aside for us to can and to stockpile. So if something happens in our community, I believe we're in dire times, and I believe that food shortages could happen. And amongst our tribal people, I believe that we should have that stockpile. So if we can't get food, our community can come to their garden. They know that there's food there. So I want to begin to can up that sauce, can up, you know, the different things, and bring meats and chickens and things that will sustain a life, you know, and, you know, that it would always have an abundance. But I want to see the people involved, because it's about the people, and it's about the song, and it's about the drum and the dance and the laughter back to our communities. And that's what my heart sings for, you know, to bring everyone together. You know, you have such good talks around food, good laughter around food. We share food over sadness. We have children with food. You know, we have birthdays with food. You know, and this is the element of that. So why can't we love it here too? And so that's my dream. What's your dream, Dan?
I'd like to see the teaching aspect expand.
Yeah.
To see more of our people with home gardens. Because this farm cannot supply the whole tribe.
Right again.
With the climate change, you know, a lot of our farmland is going to turn to dust.
Yeah, when a disaster comes in and destroys the soil, you've got all that to rebuild. You're right. You're right.
If you had those big families like I was telling you, where we took care of corn or garden products, where we got sick of seeing each other for 2 weeks of gathering. Not many people do that much longer. So, yeah.
For the families, did in recent history or in long ago history, did families have their own corn that they grew that was special to that family?
That's what I understand. That's what I understand. But a lot of that has been ruined with the cross-pollination. Field corns with our corns and vice versa. And there used to be a family amongst us who had a blood red corn. And I understand they still have it, but they're stingy with it. They won't let it go. It's all right. That's theirs. That belongs to them. But a lot of us, we depend now on this common mixed colored corn. White, yellow, black, whatever. And that's what we have to do to continue. Adaptation, we call it. If we didn't adapt, you, I, whoever would be gone. My nephew and a few of our associates had become acquainted with some people from New York. We've started trading seed. And the intent is to save a portion of that seed and try and grow some now and crossbreed it with our existing seed to re-strengthen a stock, or, you know. And we had tobacco. We grow tobacco for sacred doings, and they're the biggest babies there are. They're more possessive than the possessive girlfriend or whatever, but they require time. They're worse than children, and you gotta baby them. You gotta be with them. You gotta talk with them. They're social plants. They don't have that interaction. Their leaves don't come out as big. They're very particular on who touches and grows those. Young ladies aren't permitted to work with them. It's only the elders and people who aren't under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and so they're that sensitive. We garden, and I'm glad that they're doing that for their communities. Well, when I say we garden, I'm talking we garden. It's nothing like that. That's like a flower box. And our family, it's a large garden, and makes that one look like playtime. But the attempt to show the young people, it's good, very good. And I'll say this, something that small is easily taken care of, easily. But something from here to the pine trees away, that way, it's a lot of walking, stooping, crawling, and pulling, and then you wish you had a little bitty garden like that. So, and you often have to convince yourself, like, oh, we gotta do this. It has to be done. And who's gonna do it if you don't do it? So, like that. And it's a hope that that community will sit there and say, why don't we do something that big? There's enough of us where, you know, like that. And I wish communities would say, hey, give us a 1/4 acre so we can plant. That'd be fantastic. Squash, corn, beans. But right now, the little gardens are fine until that need for it grows into those individuals. You know, and maybe that's a fine way to grab your young people from letting them go astray too far and reach back and say, hey, help us with this. Take part in this. Or even with adults. who are attempting to straighten out their lives and say, well, yeah, I'll occupy my time doing this, rather than trying to figure out how to beat the system or think they're beating the system. Sweet dream. Perfect soil. Anything that we have now, we have very few farmlands on our sides of the river which are not suitable for the growing that we need. Presently, my nephews, we go on lease lands for a season. We have somebody plant for us. But as far as the cultivating and caretaking, we do that. Here, this is a sweet site. As Muscadet is, but that's 99 miles away. We have a few farms to the north on this side of the Black River, black earth, not sand. So, if you ever looked at the little bitty gardens at Blue Wing or Sand Pillow, sand. These people bring in soil. So, yeah. You can't farm in sand unless you're doing potatoes, so, yeah.
Okay. So the soil up here is rich?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.